In the mental health field, too often, we've made it seem as if it's just in your head. Just in your head.
The landlord can hijack the rent by 20%. That impacts people's mental health.
Can't have a profit-driven mental health care system if we want our people to be connected and healthy.
Hi, everybody. Welcome back to It's Not Just in Your Head, two therapists who talk about how capitalism impacts mental health. My name is Max Golding, LMFT, and we have Harriet. Harriet, who are you?
I am Harriet Fraud, and I am or Dr. Harriet Fraud, if you want to get formal over it. And I am a mental health counselor and hypnotherapist in private practice in New York City, as well as an activist.
And today we're going to be talking with Angie Speaks, who is a YouTuber and podcaster, and she focuses mainly on left-wing politics, political issues generally. She has a kind of Jungian archetypal analysis to things sometimes, like a sort of witchy, pagan kind of flavor she throws in the mix of her commentary and videos and conversations, which I think is really cool and unique of her. And but before we forget, actually, a big thank you to our patrons First Winter, Sarah Turner, Rebecca Johns, Justin Harper, and Bandila Msimanga. And of course, Liam, thank you for the editing with the social media. So
yes, and thank you all from me as well. Patrons are important, and Liam, you're a marvel.
Yeah. So anyway, with that out of the way, we have Angie on to talk about not necessarily entirely her latest video, but we're going to kind of start with that. It was a video. Oh God, Angie, I'm forgetting the title. It was like how validation
ruined your life, Narcissism and Social Justice.
Thank you. Yeah. So so it sparked. Harriet and I both watched it, and we had a lot of thoughts on it. I thought you made a lot of excellent points. I think we wanted to actually push back a little bit as well to look at maybe even starting with like the valid points of quote unquote identity politics, or where like how do we kind of drift back to like understanding, well, where did this stuff come from, and what are the things that make sense about why people even focus on those kinds of like who they are and all of that, right? Before we maybe jump into your general critique. So we were curious of what you think from the others, if we pendulum to that other side of what is valid, to use that language, like to validate that identity piece. Like, you know, are there somewhat like generalizable things we can say about people's quote unquote lived group experiences? Can it be helpful to focus on these things at all? Or do you just think like at this point, it's just totally, it's all sort of essentialism and all of that, you know, is there anything helpful about that framework in your opinion?
I want to add a slight variation that just strengthens Max's question, which is, how do you see the inspiration and excitement that sometimes inspires in identity politics and people who join identity politics? How could it be combined with a unified class politics that acknowledges identities under one umbrella and gives us power of many groups?
So I guess to answer the question in short, the answer is yes and no, in my opinion. In the video, I sort of kind of decided I was going to go back to the roots of identity, because it's this sort of preoccupation with identity is quite a modern fixture. For most of human history, people viewed their identity as their social role. And their sense of purpose that kind of came out of their social role. And, during the Romantic period of art and philosophy, that was when you started to see this kind of desire for self-excavation emerge. And, a new sort of tool, new analytical tools, new philosophical tools for the excavation of identity came about. That then heavily influenced modernity. And, depending on where you stand philosophically, you may think that the Romantic period and the, tools for excavation that came out of it are a positive thing or a negative thing. I sort of think that it's a mixed bag. But we can't deny how this impulse manifests itself under a capitalist system. one that, especially under neoliberalism, one that drives us to commodify and to understand the human experience through the process of commodification, and also market logic in terms of competition and, vying for a position and all of those different things. And when it comes to identity politics as it manifests in modernity, what we are seeing is really an attempt. It's sort of been obfuscated and co-opted. It's been used to obfuscate, and it's been co-opted by the ruling ideology as a way to obfuscate more universal concerns. Of course, there's a shared experience among people who come from certain identity groups, and even a sense of affinity. But what you're seeing now is, this sort of push to characterize all of the problems that plague us in modernity as being hinged upon identity-based struggles, rather than general economic struggles and class struggles. I mean, an example of this, for instance, under COVID, for instance, like the pandemic that's been going on, in the media, there's been a push to racialize the categories that are affected by coronavirus. When really and truly, if you actually look at the data, poverty and lack of economic access is the main problem. But, back in the day, the media used to say, if it bleeds, it leads. But now that's sort of morphed into, if it's racialized, it leads. The things that tend to get the most attention, the things that tend to get the most coverage are things that are racialized. And I've even seen a push to racialize things or spin racialized narratives around things that aren't actually even racialized, or more information comes out later that shows that this specific incident wasn't even something that was racialized. And it ends up distracting away from more universal experiences and also the general class struggle. And when you say, is there a way to sort of merge identity and the class struggle, I think that there's a general solidarity that people that emerges when people gather together around shared material interests. There's this sort of thing that, I've seen, especially among the political left, this idea that we can't come together and do anything unless everybody believes the right things, or unless everybody has cleansed themselves of the original sin of these unconscious bigotries. And I think that it's sort of jumping in front of the process. I mean, one example I could give is in the UK. Uber employees recently won a victory. They unionized and they won a victory against Uber so that they would be treated as, employees and given benefits. And there are people from all kinds of backgrounds who came together, from conservative Muslims to your average white working class person to your average young, person who's sort of trying to find their way in the gig economy. All kinds of people from all kinds of different belief systems and backgrounds came together around their shared material interest. And out of that arose a camaraderie and a deeper appreciation for each other. I think it's more of an organic process, and it's not necessarily something that you can necessarily push or force. And what I see in culture at the moment is, especially through the culture that's like, arisen around anti-racism, which really ends up reifying most of the categories that it supposedly attempts to nullify, is this sort of push to jump in front of that process of like the natural solidarity that arises when people join together around their shared interests. So in terms of, to answer your question, does identity politics have utility? Yes, on a personal level, I feel like it's important for people to understand themselves and to understand their place in the world. And it can be very enriching to explore one's roots or to historicize one's experience. But when we're talking about the domain of politics and the political, I think it can be a major obstruction if it's not like employed incredibly carefully. And what we see right now is this massive free-for-all, this one-size-fits-all attitude. And it's been so unconstrained to the point where the powerful and the hegemonic kind of interests are now using it as a tool for obfuscation, divide and conquer, and, a distraction really from the things that bring us together.
I think that really is important. And I know from my research and reading that the FBI and the CIA invested very heavily in Gloria Steinem, a CIA agent, to make sure the women's liberation movement was gender only and the civil rights movement was race only. I understand that, but I also understand that people who have an identity that is demoted in value, despised, pigeonholed, do gain something from affirming their power together. And that's a balance, because I know the women's movement best as someone who was a founding mother of that movement, New Haven, Connecticut, and has been heavily invested in following it and being involved in it since, that there was a sense of enormous power in acknowledging that we who had an identity based on subservience could change that identity and then bond with others. The problem is that you need both. You need to say, we need an identity because no human being should be arbitrarily considered submissive to another. And therefore that has to stop. And if people feel more comfortable in a group that is just women or just Black people, fine, but we won't win without each other. And so I think that there's a balance between ending an identity as less and also realizing whatever identity we have multiple identities, as Assad Haider says, and one of them is a class identity and the other is a national identity. And we need to juggle all of these identities without neglecting any of them.
I disagree that class is an identity. I reject the premise, because class is about your material relationship to power. And in America, for instance, the racial struggle, you cannot divorce it from the class struggle, because the entire reason that racial categories were created in the first place was in order to create an underclass. Underclass that labor could be extracted from, that value could be extracted from. So really and truly, the racial category in and of itself was not separate from class domination. The same thing with woman as an identity. Yes. Women were the class of reproductive laborers. Yeah. And many of these identity struggles that you're talking about are intrinsically bound up in the class struggle, and to divorce them from the class struggle. The real problem started when these identity-based struggles were divorced from the overarching class struggle. That's how you have these atomized little kind of bubbles where nothing material has been achieved. And that's my major problem, is if we look at the confluence of history since identity politics happened, very little materially has changed. I mean, Black Americans now are worse off than they were in the 60s economically. Yes. They're worse off than they were economically. In the 60s, very little material has been achieved, despite the affirmation and the increased representation and the social platitudes, Black Lives Matter, this, that. On the ground, in the material where it actually matters, very little has been accomplished. The cultural posturing of the left ends up just reifying the hierarchies that it claims to be trying to challenge with this identity movement. And this identity movement is basically, it's like the shock troops of progressive capitalism. And it sort of LARPs, it kind of pretends to be radical when it really is just reifying all of the premises of the hierarchy that we're existing under. And we have to reckon with this, in my opinion.
I think so too. We have to reckon with it, but we also have to remember that it is an empowerment at the same time as it can be used as a disempowerment on a class basis. And so that if you recognize the validity of talking to one another and affirming with one another your importance as a group that has been despised, but understanding that whatever group you're in, you're going to be immiserated unless you unify with other groups on a class basis.
But I don't know if affirmation even matters at this point in history where things are desperate. I don't care if somebody thinks that I'm special because I'm Black. I want to be able to pay my rent. I want to know that my children are going to have a decent quality of education. I want to know that my kids are going to have access to healthcare. I want to know that, I'm going to have a decent future. I think that the emphasis on this sort of therapeutic lexicon is being used to kind of obfuscate the dire material needs that people from all over the spectrum are. I mean, even here in the UK, there was a statistic that recently came out that young white working class men are among the most economically precarious and psychologically vulnerable.
Yes.
And you saw identity movements, especially within like the Labour Party sector, basically trying to shove this statistic away because it didn't necessarily fit within the narrative of, the categories of oppression that they feel deserve the most priority. And we cannot continue to view reality in this way if we are actually going to accomplish anything material and tangible. I feel like it has been used in a way. And I mean, if somebody wants to personally validate someone, there's nothing wrong with that. In our interpersonal interactions, we should, affirm people. But when it comes to the political with a capital P, I feel like we have to be incredibly careful about how we address identity in a way that doesn't end up obfuscating the general and very real and very pressing material problems that are on the ground.
I totally agree with you, but I think that those people, those young women who took the video of George Floyd being lynched and then released it so everyone could see that, wouldn't have felt emboldened to do that without a Black identity movement. And I think that there is a balance. You need both. You certainly need a class politic, and America is particularly afflicted. We are particularly afflicted by an anti-communist movement of the 50s that wiped out a vital class-oriented left, both socialist parties, the Communist Party, and the vitality of our labor movement. So I totally agree on that, but I also think that there is something about identity politics or an identity political movement within the rubric of a class movement that says, I am someone, I can speak at a meeting, I can record the cops, I am empowered too, not only by a class position, but I have something extra as a woman, as a Black, whatever. And it all can be perverted and misused, and is.
I guess I just wanted to say, I honestly, like, the George Floyd, the reason that he was even accosted in the first place was because he was forging checks. And who needs to do that to survive? A very poor person in incredibly economically deprived circumstances. It wasn't just racialized. And the thing is, in America, the reason why these class issues become racialized is because Black people were brought to America as an underclass of disposable and cheap labor. It's a labor as property, as disposable and cheap labor. It cannot be divorced from the class struggle. And I don't think you need an identitarian. I don't think you need to have an identitarian movement in order to understand Black struggle and the things that happen to Black people in America. as intrinsically linked to the overarching class struggle, and to also pay special attention to the way that the historicized struggle of Black people is tied to the historical class struggle. I mean, even Fred Hampton, this was the huge fallout that Fred Hampton had with the Black Panther Party, because you had the Black Panther Party was a hodgepodge of people like Fred Hampton who came from a more Marxist perspective. But then you also had Black nationalists who saw Black identity as the prime and most important aspect, and also Black separatism as the prime and most important aspect of Black struggle. And they were not interested in solidarity with other people.
No,
they were not interested.
As somebody who was active then and who knew what was going on in an important locus in the Black Panther Party, they were riddled by cops who were paid by the FBI to divide people.
Of course, and they also those FBI informants also took advantage of these dynamics. Yes. They took advantage of the ideological differences between these factions. And one of the problems that I see with movements like Black Lives Matter now is the fact that you have a huge contingency, a massive contingency, in fact, even the ruling contingency of that movement, who are, very much invested in the idea of it as a purely racialized struggle, and also obfuscate the deep class dimension, the dimension that links it to all kinds of other struggles and problems that are going on in America right now, Right. And that's the thing. That's the thing that's like the major issue. And also the fact that, a lot of the demands for healing of this problem end up being around quote unquote representation, creating a Black bourgeoisie class as sort of a way of making up for historical ills, which then ends up leaving the masses of poor and working class Black people by the wayside, and also divided away from poor and working class people of other communities too. When it comes to police violence and police brutality in America, if you look at the statistics, Black people as the sort of underclass from chattel slavery obviously get it the worst. But there's also a massive problem across the spectrum of police brutality in general when it comes to poverty. Within the Hispanic community, it's a huge issue as well. Among poor whites, it's also a massive issue too. And I think by saying that all of the problems of America are hinged upon identity actually obscures the wide array of issues in America that need addressing, that would deeply alleviate a lot of the things that we're seeing happening to the end.
I totally agree. However, you can't say all of the problems are anything. And I think one of the reasons so many Black people are killed by the police is they're disposable. And there is a sense that if you shoot a Black man to death or Black woman or girl to death, it doesn't count as a person. And that has to be addressed, as well as the class position of Black people who are cultivated as an exploitable underclass. Both of those things have to be recognized. And what has happened is that those movements that started out including identity around a class basis, like Martin Luther King was killed when he started talking about Black and white together. And when he said at the Longshoremen's Union address, unionism is the best weapon against segregation. And Malcolm X was shot for the same reason, because he said the people following me in Europe were not the Muslim Brotherhood. It was the CIA, and that Black and whites have got to fight together. That had to be included. And I think you could have both. And the way the system works is to valorize and invest heavily in perverting the discussion so that it's gender only, race only, and excising the class dimension and leaving some possibilities for women, for Black people to advance into the bourgeoisie, and as a goal of a movement which is to include everyone, not to include a chosen few. And that has declined in America, and it needs to be strengthened, and is beginning with DSA. Sorry.
I'm kind of wondering, because I lived with this PhD sociology Marxist guy a couple of years ago who I was much more in the my sort of activism where I lived was so entrenched into the social justice and identity politic driven, and also like online algorithm driven, sort of like constant horizontal hostility of just like call outs of people all the if you don't use the right term and all that. And I remember him being totally opposed to this at a time when I didn't even know you were allowed to be opposed to it. And he was like he was generally very quiet around. He had learned really quickly that like him sharing an alternative perspective was the best way to be kind of like psychologically subjugated by like large groups of people, whether online or in person. And so he was trying to be really careful and saying to me, he'd ask these questions like, so we'd get into this exact debate that we're having right now. And that I would say, well, what about like an entry point, right? Like if you're a lesbian, if you're trans, if you're Black, if you're whatever, like if the entry point is like, you look at yourself and you say, I am experiencing these things that only an X experiences. So I'm an X. And so there's the X experience. And what if that's an entry point toward the other stuff? And he was like pushing back on that, saying, well, but like where, like toward what? Like what is it supposed to, what would be it's an entry point toward what, And I think like, because what you're kind of saying, Harriet, is like, well, what if it's an entry point toward a class consciousness, toward a class politics? And I think the challenge, I think that you're describing, Angie, and kind of just listening to both of these, I guess, but I don't think they're actually like opposing sides. I think they're contradictions that we can kind of like put together to find something. I think you're saying that if we actually look at the discourse that is occurring right now, that it's not necessarily moving toward class consciousness. That you can actually, that Black Lives Matter, for example, we can find so many instances in which it's the prevailing media narrative, like you said, if it bleeds, it leads, that keeping it as racialized and almost like Black separatist-esque as possible keeps it within the framework that you yourself just said, Harriet, is sort of what the FBI, CIA wanted to happen in the long term. Let's only talk about like police brutality is only a racialized thing. The prison system is only racialized, disparities in schools and et cetera, it's all racialized. And then you can add in other sort of disparitarian things. You can say, oh, well, like trans suicide rates, or I wanted to bring up too, because you mentioned kind of growing up or having a lot of sort of being within immigrant communities in the UK, Angie, and in the sort of tenant union organizing that I do these days, there's this one particular member who's undocumented, and he doesn't walk around being like, I identify as an undocumented. Sometimes he makes jokes where he's like, I'm one of the illegals or whatever. But he was kind of informing me the other day about this like relatively universal sense of despair of like South American immigrants in the U.S. who they've been fleeing violence for like decades, and they get here and he was just saying there is actually a relatively collective like sense of just total despair and alienation, and this sort of, he thinks it's almost this pathological sense of almost over identification with the original culture they came from, that they can't go back to, first of all, because it's just the conditions are so fucked there. They're never gonna like go back to how it was. So it's this almost like he thinks it's sort of just being stuck in trauma. As well as like also hating this culture, because they're just like, well, all these like white people fucking hate us, and like at all the Trump shit that was talked about for the last 4 years, and this constant fear of deportation and stuff. And I guess I wanted to sort of shift to this question that I think is relevant to this general debate. Like, is it helpful for us to think of like, oh, well, that's the immigrant identity. There's the identity of the Latinos, that's a Latinx identity struggle versus, for example, right? Because if you think of it from a historical perspective, you think, well, why is South America so fucked up? Well, that has to do with like U.S. imperialism, interventionism, as the same arm of McCarthyism and anti-communism of fighting all the socialist uprisings and efforts in South America for the last, century really, after the U.S. like stole, and the reason I'm in Santa Barbara, California right now is because like Mexico was stolen from from like people south to us, like through again, it was militarism. It wasn't people were like, well, my identity is better than yours, so let's subjugate the identity. It was like, we have military power, we have a government that's backing the military power, we have funding from all around us, and then let's just kill people and let's draw borders and let's enforce it through power, like actual material power. And that's sort of historically how the immigration problem here happened. And then so that there is I guess to sort of end this rant to say, I can see how, well, I think actually if we had like this guy on the podcast, I think he would actually agree that a starting point from saying like, hey, is your landlord trying to fuck with you? Is your boss trying to fuck with you? That would probably be a better starting point than saying like, hey, like, I'm so sorry that the microaggressions are happening to you, that and when you got in the elevator, the white lady clutched your purse. Like you must feel so like worn out from that. Like you must feel so offended that the average undocumented immigrant who's getting paid below minimum wage because the boss can do that would probably have like a much better like psychologically healing experience if a law were passed that just gave amnesty to all immigrants, and so that all the laws around minimum wage and healthcare access and shit like kicked in for them overnight. They would probably like you. They'd be like, "Oh, I'll definitely work with you on some political projects."
That's the passive aggressive nature of this therapeutic mode. The mode that says you are valid. Oh, sorry, your microaggressions. Oh, you need to feel empowered. It's sort of this passive aggressive move by progressive capitalism to nullify the pressing class issues that are on the ground. And like you said, like the idea that like these identity-based grievances are sort of an entryway to class politics. They're not. We can see the tangible evidence on the ground now that the culture that has arisen out of that is basically the opposite. Like we don't need the CIA to do obfuscation anymore because we're doing it on our own, driven by this algorithmic, attention-based kind of grievance economy. And also driven by the fact that the class struggle and class narrative has been obfuscated by this kind of therapeutic lexicon married with the agenda of like progressive capital. You know, there is, and also married to the fact that there is no left at the moment. It doesn't exist. Okay, there's no institutional left with any power. Of course, there are people who are ideologically inclined towards the left. But when we're talking about, especially in the US and in the UK where I'm from, you know, when we're talking about a left that actually has institutional power, there is no left. There's nowhere to lead people to. I mean, even the things that are posturing as left are basically just like I said, shock troops for progressive capital. I mean, I even have criticism of the DSA. The DSA is basically the left wing of the Democratic Party in that sense. People see that.
It is. However,
people see that. People see it, and people see the sort of astroturfing operation that's going on, and the way that this sort of cultural like project is being used to obscure their actual like material concerns. Black Lives Matter made an insane amount of money in the last year and a half. Yeah. And people are still trying to figure out exactly where that money went to, what happened to it. A lot of it ended up in the pockets of the DNC. People see exactly what is going on, and they're rightly disillusioned by it, but there is no alternative to sort of point them towards at the moment.
That's true. There's an
element of like disillusionment that I feel like it's almost a nihilism, in my opinion, that makes people double down on this identity stuff, because they're like, oh, well, there's no like valid release valve for class struggle, so I'm just going to go on all day about how like I'm valid and how I'm black girl magic, or, you know, all of this stuff. But that doesn't actually mean anything. It's complete bollocks. Like, I want healthcare. Like, people need to eat. People need their children to be educated. People need to not be exploited by predatory landlords. Absolutely. Like, there's so much more that we could do collectively. And you talked about the immigrant experience. Like, I'm a third generation Nigerian migrant to the UK. Nigeria was an ex-British colony. And, you know, during the 60s and the early 50s, a lot of people from the empire migrated to England to basically help rebuild after World War II. So England, the center of the empire, basically relaxed its immigration policies to bring people in from India, the Caribbean, Africa, all kinds of different places to help rebuild. And usually the people who came were in their countries, the sort of educated middle class. And they thought they were coming with the promise of getting middle class jobs. But they came and ended up being street cleaners, taxi drivers, nurses if they were lucky, basically all of this sort of menial labor, was what was available to them. And that was sort of my family's immigration story. And we grew up around white working class. You know, the white working class in the UK have also been, even though they weren't, you know, colonial subjects, most of them were brutalized in like the workhouses, or they came from families where, you know, their great grandfather was working in a factory for 18 hours for like no pay, and, you know, or died trying to struggle with his union. You know, and there's a tremendous amount of solidarity, even without any of the bullshit anti-racism nonsense, you know, without that, the fact that like we all live among each other, and even though we have our different unique struggles, there's the understanding that like the overarching system is the problem. The overarching system is what's keeping us all down. And I mean, in modern times now, that anti-racism ideology has sort of been exported from America to the UK, and it's created a tremendous amount of exacerbation of these divisions. You know, Black people are now expected to be viewed as purely racialized subjects. That genuine humanity, that like genres of music, like, you know, drum and bass or house music or, you know, ska, you know, the white sort of working class interacting with like the Caribbean communities and the African communities, that's now gone. It's gone completely. You know, one of the things that was super popular here last year was Robin DiAngelo's book, White Fragility, which I believe is probably, it's like the Mein Kampf of white liberals, in my opinion. It's like a curse. It's a curse on the human psyche. You know, the people who are getting rich, people like her are getting rich off of pushing racial essentialism, off of pushing the idea that Black people are purely racialized subjects and should be viewed purely through a trans-historical narrative of oppression rather than as people. And she's got laughing all the way to the bank. You know, all these companies now in the UK are charging $5,000 per person to sit through an anti-racism seminar, so these people can cleanse themselves of the original sin and point to the anti-racism certificate they have on the wall to show how unracist they are and how woke they are. It's become an industry. It's become an industrial complex.
Well, they will use anything. They will use anything and monetize anything they have. And perhaps a model of what would be a lot better for us is the dynamic of the Communist Party in the United States in the 30s and 40s until the end of the war and the huge anti-communist crusade. There's a book called Hammer and Hoe by Robin Kelly. I think it's by Robin Kelly. And it's about the Black and white tenant unions in the South. We never hear about this in our history books, which were enormously powerful. They were unions of tenant farmers, and they were enormously militant to end tenant farming as a system in the American South, organized by the Communist Party. And then across the country, the Communist Party organized people and recognized that the United States which introduced Black people to the United States as property, was using race to divide and had to be fought. But it was under the rubric of class unity. And I think that's what we need. We need to recognize that people come from different places, but we desperately need each other or we will never win.
Which is the most important thing. But the way that racialized ideology was used as a tool to divide and conquer in the past, you know, this new anti-racist ideology, which still reifies all of the premises of racialized ideology with its essentialism, has now become the new sort of justifying ideology for class division, except now it has the moral cover of anti-racism.
Well, how does it justify class division? Would you elaborate on that?
Black people within racialized ideology. So number one, the vantage point from which struggle is viewed within this sort of anti-racist ideology, this sort of liberal anti-racist ideology, is that race is the crux and not class. So it ends up obfuscating the generalized class struggle. And number two, Black people are viewed as purely racialized subjects. within this ideology. It essentializes us as purely racialized subjects. And that then obscures the humanity. When you read something like White Fragility, what Robin DiAngelo is like, when you talk to a Black person, you have to kind of like view them through this struggle of oppression, and you have to take into, and rather than just like as a person, and you have all these white people who feel like they have to walk on eggshells around Black people, and it takes away from the solidarity and the genuine humanity. Like I have a white boyfriend. He comes from a white working class family. I come from a Nigerian family. When our families come together, my family is absolutely vulgar. His family is absolutely vulgar, but there's like a shared sense of like humor about it. There's a shared sense of solidarity about it. Nobody's walking on eggshells around each other because we're seeing each other as human beings, not as purely essentialized, racialized subjects. And something like liberal anti-racism says that white people are inherently racist and they have all these implicit biases, that they must consume products, buy books in order to exercise themselves of, and that Black people are these purely racialized subjects whose humanity is sort of viewed through this trans-historical narrative of oppression. And that's evil. And they're teaching this shit to children. They're teaching this shit to children in schools now. And it's basically... It's occupying the same function. Yeah, it's occupying the same function that racism used to occupy. The system has cleverly sort of camouflaged its aims under something that now gives it this sort of moral justification. Now that racism is no longer palatable in the 21st century, it's evolved into something far more pernicious, and it has a moral cover of like this anti-racist facade. So anyone who questions it is seen as like a bigot or somebody who's trying to sow division or this or that. It's very disturbing, and that's kind of the reason why I feel like it's so important for us to question and excavate the way that identity politics is currently operating, and how it's become a tool to obfuscate, class struggle and the general solidarity that we need in order to get anything done.
I agree with you completely about that. And I think one of the models for doing it differently, although they made, of course, many mistakes, was the Communist Party, which was very sensitive to racial injustice, but was a class-based politics. And I think you need to be sensitive to the particular struggles that all people have, but understand the unifying class oppression from which America suffers. And there are those strains on the left. Occupy reintroduced class into the American lexicon with 1%, 99% in 2011. It's not an accident that Obama, Black bourgeois supreme, crushed Occupy across the United States, had the cops come in and disband the Occupy settlements across the United States all on one day. That's a proof of the danger of class politics. And I totally agree that class politics have to be emphasized, as Malcolm X did before he was killed, and also as Martin Luther King did, the two 100%. Great leaders of our era.
Max, you mentioned the hostility as well that people are met with when they do try to center class. And this is something that I personally have experienced. You get called a class reductionist, you get called a crypto-fascist, you're pushed out of left spaces. Like somebody like Adolph Reed, who comes from a very similar perspective as, his book Class Notes was what even made me question a lot of the operations of the liberal left. They wouldn't let Adolph Reed speak at the DSA. This is a Black Marxist who has been around for a very long time. They would not let him speak, and they did an entire character assassination campaign against him. They take this incredibly scorched earth approach that even surprises me. It's almost like they use FBI, CIA kind of tactics against anybody who tries to number one, challenge the mode of operation, or number two, bring about the importance of class in a way that sort of centers it. I can name countless people, who have tried to fight against this Leviathan. But it seems almost impossible to, because anybody who tries to take on that mode of operation is absolutely, completely and utterly destroyed. It's something that I've been fighting throughout my entire, career as like a public person in that sense. It's something that has threatened to destroy me on several occasions and all of the people around me. And it's hard to hold on to the hope that there can be a resurgence when, these people are literally the shock troops for progressive capital, and they do the bidding of it.
They are, and they do. However, there is another tendency on the left. Someone who is an avowed Marxist with an utterly class analysis, Richard Wolff, on Democracy Now! And the movement to change our economy into a co-op economy based on a class analysis, is more popular than it has been since the 40s. That there are other tenets. That political correctness is just silly, and I think it alienates anyone. But also there is this differentiation that you are a leftist because you want to win for class justice, or you're a leftist, you want to appear moral against other people with whom you find fault. It's very different. And
we're up against the neoliberal establishment, which has a tremendous amount of power and that has vested interest in keeping this mode of operation intact, which is why there is this scorched earth approach to anybody. I mean, I know people who have been completely deplatformed, people who have been pushed out of academia, people who have had their entire jobs and their livelihoods ruined for trying to push this kind of perspective. And yes, there are enclaves of hope, but nothing that's powerful enough at the moment to face the immense amount of power that the neoliberal establishment has to continue this kind of obfuscation. And I guess what I'm interested in is sort of like pushing and also helping protect dissident perspectives, because dissident perspectives are met with an entire amount of, even Silicon Valley, is one of the arms of progressive capital that is working to censor and is working to push down any sort of dissident perspective, any kind of dissent against this mode of operation, and the people who, like the Robin DiAngelos of the world, are laughing all the way to the bank and, get accolades, win Pulitzer Prizes. We're up against something tremendously pernicious, but also something that has a tremendous amount of power. And really and truly, the political left at the moment are the shock troops of progressive capitalism. And that's what has the power.
They can be, but on the other hand, American people are questioning the neoliberal marvel of, quote, democracy, end quote, in a way that they haven't for a long, long time. And so that that's what I think the right-wing movement has a lot of, a question that they didn't deliver. Of course, they're poorer because the capitalists exported their jobs, but they're presented as that they're poorer because of other people who want an opportunity who are even poorer than they. However, there is a dissatisfaction. One of the reasons that only half of even a progressive city like New York City, 56% vaccinations, they don't even trust the government at all. They don't trust the government. They don't trust the corporations. There's a sense of despair into which a left of the kind you would believe in, Angie, and I do, can emerge. However, it will have to fight political correctness as a weapon of division. Because you can recognize identity without devolving into political correctness, which is quite different.
I also think, and we're gonna have to cut it in a couple of minutes. This is we sped through it, but I think I fluctuate between hope and hopelessness a lot with these kinds of things. I think over the last couple of years, like when I mentioned tenant organizing and have been involved in some labor to me, like once I sort of my own, I think, class consciousness clicked, and I was like, I'm just going to do that stuff. I'm not going to kind of waste my time with any of the other bullshit. I found that on the one hand, they're really small pockets. I mean, labor in the U.S., even if the PRO Act wins, I mean, it's kind of slim chance, but even if it wins, I think it's not like labor is going to come back like it was the 1930s or whatever in the US. I think there's still going to be a lot of challenges. I do think, and I would to reinforce and agree with you, Angie, on like so the tenant organizing stuff I got involved in at the beginning of the pandemic. I'd never done any tenant organizing before. I wouldn't say that it was sparked by this sort of like silly rent strike hashtag, but it was there was some online stuff that was happening. And then I realized, even though I was like, I'm not losing my job, I'm still going to be okay. But I was like, oh, wow, this is like a massive moment where paying rent is going to be like the biggest issue in my lifetime. And so I'm going to kind of jump into that. And our tenants union has grown. Like it's like all I do with my spare time now. And we keep finding more and more and more people that are like, oh, the rent's too high, or like we need more renter protections or whatever. And so I guess what gives me hope is that there are, if you look at just sort of class struggle projects, even though they're small, and although I think like having an actual socialist workers party in the US would be much better than say DSA, because DSA, as you're saying, like DSA is kind of, it's a mixed bag. I mean, there are some really great people. There are people that are just openly sort of communists or whatever, and they kind of get it. And then there's total idiots. Like there's total idiots running a lot of DSA that have no fucking clue. Like they would be, I think they'd be really offended by most of what we talked about today. And they'd just be like, we don't want those people in DSA kind of attitude. But
I know a lot of people in the DSA who are like old school socialists that have been pushed out and just had to leave. Yeah. But also it's not necessarily just about the individuals. It's also about the fact that the DSA is intrinsically linked to the neoliberal apparatus and the DNC.
Well, it's a 501c4. So it's, I mean, the point of it is to raise money for political candidates and stuff. But like, so there's a lot of, there's structural problems with it. But I guess the tiny bit of hope that I keep hanging on to, I think, is twofold. One is that, like, as Harriet brought up, like, you know, Richard Wolff has said many times now over the last, say, 5 to 10 years, there's been more interest in his entire life in academia and talking about socialism, like the word socialism, these concepts. I think the reason we're talking about this, right? The reason that you, Angie, somehow found Adolf Reed and then read class notes and stuff, and that I went from, say, 2 to 4 years ago from being like a total, I want to be a part of Surge and be a white ally. Like I was that guy, you know, and I was the guy that the people of color who are the sort of loudest in my community were like, yeah, Max is a pretty like solid white ally or whatever. And I just always felt so good inside, like, oh, I've been validated for being, I said the right thing about how like the white people are bad. Like I was that, you know, I was that kind of guy. And like, but I'm not anymore. Now it's embarrassing. I'm just like, what a waste of time. That was like childish. But so just, I think just to have a meta zooming out of our conversation before we end to say, like, the fact that we're having this conversation shows me that there is potentially an opening and a shift in consciousness. And some of the projects that I've just been personally involved in, they're small, and I don't know if they can actually build into this sort of mass organizations or whatever it is that's neat. I don't know if we need like the vanguard party. I think that's the other thing, is we don't know exactly what the fuck will actually get us to what like a quote unquote real like significant institutionalized left power would be. We don't know exactly. It's not we're not in like 1917 USSR or so, you know what I mean? Like that, I think that fantasy too is really a huge problem, where people are like, oh, well, I'm a Marxist Leninist and da-da-da-da. It's like, dude, that's big so time. Long. Things are so different now. Like we can't really, talking like that is also, I think, a little bit, it's like you're online too much, dude, you know, like
touch grass is what I tell those people, to go out and touch some grass.
Touch grass. Sure. Yeah. So anyway, so I have a little bit more of hope, but like, since we're going to leave our patrons for the reading group hanging, do you have like in the last, maybe in like a minute, any sort of final thing, like stuff you want to plug, like links or things you want people to check out? We can put your channel and the Low Society link in the description.
Oh, sure. Thanks. Just my channel, Angie Speaks, and then also which is also going through its own little like evolution at the moment. And then also I do a podcast called Low Society, where I talk with my partner about a lot of the stuff that's going on in terms of like and class struggle and identity politics, and attempt to sort of demystify a lot of the sort of areas of tension that are happening at the moment. So yeah, you can find me there. I'm also at Speaks Angie on Twitter as well, if you're interested in seeing more. And thank you for having me on. It's been a very passionate,
discussion.
It's been a very passionate discussion.
I wanted to add just a moment of hope before we stop, which is that Sarah Nilsson, who is the rising star in the labor movement, talks about the labor movement as a united labor movement. And the head of Nurses United does the same thing. They're the most progressive, most militant leaders of the labor movement today. So that's the hope that I want to leave the audience with.
Okay. And also, it's okay. We will validate your hopelessness. You're valid for feeling hopeless. If you're a listener who you're like, we're just fucked, that's valid. Just, I guess, to ironically be like, yes, that's valid. Your identity as a hopeless person,
as a doomer, for sure.
It's a valid position to have no hope. So, okay, well, yeah, thank you so much, Angie, and
thank you for having me. Thank you.
By the way, listeners, if you have enjoyed anything you've heard Harriet say in this program, you will definitely enjoy Capitalism Hits Home, which is a solo program that Harriet does through Democracy at Work, which is a worker-owned cooperative that produces other great programs such as Economic Update with Richard Wolff and the Anti-Capitalist Chronicles with David Harvey. I can't recommend enough that everyone also listen to Capitalism Hits Home if you enjoy It's Not Just in Your Head.
Capitalism Hits Home is a sort of broader overhead view. It explores the way that capitalism shapes our personal lives, our psyches, our relationships, our families, and it looks particularly at the sea change in American personal life as all Americans, but the top 10 or 20% of Americans, have our security and our chance for a future become as precarious as it always was for minorities and families headed by women. It's not just in your head, and Capitalism Hits Home are definitely complementary.
And if listeners would like to check out Capitalism Hits Home, Harriet, where should they go to find it?
Either on YouTube or Democracy at Work or on my own website, harrietfraud.com.